Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Now, billions of people around the world are living under some form of lockdown, with movements restricted as part of attempts to control the spread of the rapacious and predacious coronavirus. The impact of all that on mental health is still being assessed, but all the experts seem to agree that it is on the cusp of causing a mental health calamity across the world. Events that should have been celebrated with tens of thousands of people in crowded venues have been muted. Bells that should have been ringing out in cathedrals to mark Orthodox celebrations of Easter and calls to prayer in mosques to signal Ramadan have had their sounds echoing in deserted squares. The strangeness of all these empty places and the dramatic impact on all our lives, living and working from home and staying at home, stuck indoors, all because of a tiny microbial organism that's invisible to the naked eye. Here are how some celebrities are dealing with the isolation.
We don't go out, we don't go to restaurants, we don't do anything like that anymore here. We just eat with whiskey and with Lulu, we have a good time, we get entertained. Look at that beautiful smile she has. Huh? Oh yes. So much more fun than going outside. No more restaurants, okay? No more restaurants, forget all that. Public gatherings, restaurants, and all these gymnasiums, out the window. We stay home.
How's it go? Hot like fire. Jump, jump. All right, whose hands are clean? Is the timer go off yet? Yay!
Look at this picture here. Yeah. No biting. Come on. See, the important thing is that you stay at home because there's a curfew now. Okay, no one is allowed out, especially someone that is like 72 years old. After you're 65, you're not allowed at the house anymore in California. So we stay home and we eat here. Right? Oh yeah, that's yummy. I ate with the whiskey and there's Lulu.
Hi everybody, this is episode 2 of The Tonight Show, home edition. It's all beautiful, thank you. So, tonight we have again, it's at home. My wife is a cameraman, Winnie's the musician. Thank you so much.
Cross-section of celebrities there, telling us how they're coping with isolation. Well, the international journalist and African affairs analyst Lindsay Barrett, who you've seen many times on Arise News, has been under strict quarantine, and he joins me now via WebEx. Good to see you, Lindsay. I hope you're keeping well. Just give us a snapshot of what lockdown. Give us a snapshot of what lockdown looks like for you. Tell us your circumstances and how the limits of that have been, of all this sort of these limits that have been imposed, is affecting you.
Well, for the last 3 weeks, Charles, I've sat in one chair and looked at the outside, but I've not gone outside more than 2 or 3 times because I'm told I've reached the danger age. I'll be 79 in a few months' time, and I'm told that once you reach that age, coronavirus goes after you. So things have changed a lot.
Yes, I can imagine. I have to say that we miss you here on Arise News because, I mean, you were somebody whose analysis we valued a lot, and you certainly don't look 79. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what 79 looks like, but I mean, you don't look it. But I mean, in terms of the impact of this strict quarantine that you've had to impose on yourself, in terms of the impact that it's having on you, has it turned you into an anti-social person, as it were, the daily lockdown and travel restrictions? Because we know you as a pretty ebullient character.
Well, actually, Charles, it has forced me to understand more about the social media. I was the only thing I really interacted through before the lockdown was the WhatsApp website, or what they call it. But now my wife and my children have forced me to take more notice of Facebook, Instagram, and so on. So I've learned a bit more about how things are changing, how communication is changing. And I imagine that that has had an impact on people's lives as under the lockdown. But apart from that, I have been forced to start reading again, going back to an old habit of mine of reading books.
I was actually going to say there, listening to you, Lindsay, that it is perversely positive, isn't it? The fact that you're discovering the medium of sort of the internet as a means of communication. And I was going to ask you next, because I know you to be an avid reader and writer. I was going to ask you, I mean, what are you doing to fill the time? And if you're reading books, what books are you reading? I mean, have you rediscovered books that you probably should have read a long time ago and you didn't get around to reading and all that sort of thing?
Well, I've rediscovered some books that I read when I was much younger, and I'm rereading them, like Moby Dick, the famous American literature masterpiece. Suddenly I found that this is a book that I thought I understood, but I'm understanding much better, a bit late, but still. Another book that has really taken me by storm is called New Daughters of Africa. It's a collection of writings by colored women and incredible material, which has been with me for about 4 years or 2 years or so. And suddenly I realized I've had this book, I have not been reading it, and now I'm discovering wonderful things. I think that what this lockdown will do for a lot of people is force them to reassess, revalue their lives.
Yes, that's a very good point. But I'm sure you're aware, Lindsay, because in spite of your lockdown, you're an avid news person, you're a journalist, you're an African affairs analyst, you're an international journalist of great repute. I'm sure you're aware of the latest developments in global lockdowns. In Italy, restrictions have been eased a little. They're allowing bookshops, stationery stores, some outlets selling children's clothing to reopen. Other places as well are beginning to loosen. Even India has started to loosen some of its restrictions. China is opening up. Donald Trump in America wants a reduction in the measures. Do you think the Nigerian authorities are taking the right course? I mean, after all, it's only a partial lockdown in this country, affecting only parts of it and not the whole of it.
And even where the lockdown has been imposed, I'm not sure how stringent the controls are. Recently, Charles, I met some people who said they had come in from Zaria. And I wondered how they got in here all the way from Zaria, came by public transport and so on. This was about 5 days ago. So the lockdown may not be really as stringent as we think, but some of us have stayed in because we realize that this is a serious issue. You've noticed the increase in cases. Gradually, the records are showing a real increase. You know, I heard that in the last 2 days, there were 56 cases, which is unusual for what has been the normal rate. So we have to be careful. I think the government is reacting, especially with recent tragic deaths of some prominent people, to say the least. The government has probably increased its anxiety. But at the same time, Charles, we live in a country where daily paid laborers are a large part of our economic population. And I wonder how you are going to keep those people in, because they have to go out to have their daily bread, so to speak. So I'm sure we have a lot to do. Let me just put it that way.
So, I mean, we're going to be going on a break imminently, Lindsay, but given the economic hardships that you talked about that are being wrought by the lockdown on millions of people who are who earn their living from a daily hustle, do you think Nigeria should ease restrictions?
Well, I think if what Nigeria really needs to do, we have to increase the testing, increase surveillance, health surveillance. But I can see a point at which, frankly, I've been hoping that I could get back to my home state, and I would rather be locked down there than in Abuja. So maybe at some point we may have to relieve the controls for a few days to allow people to rearrange themselves.
Okay, stay with us, Lindsay. It's jolly nice talking with you again. Lindsay there, of course, in strict quarantine. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the challenging effects of the lockdown on different people. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Enyugolu. Now, many people in Nigeria and across the world are currently under some form of government-mandated lockdown. But forcing people to stay at home for weeks or months on end is resulting in unprecedented shocks to societies everywhere. With unemployment figures accelerating, so too is the debate about how and when to end the lockdown. Several reports have concluded that social distancing measures can only be withdrawn completely once a vaccine against COVID-19 has been developed and deployed. So until then, how do policymakers balance protecting the health and wealth of citizens? And as we wait for this strange new world to return to some semblance of normality, which part of society will be transformed beyond recognition? And how will we ourselves, physically and mentally trapped as we are, interface between lockdown measures and psychological entrapment? Well, with me via WebEx, the international journalist and African affairs analyst Lindsay Barrett, who is himself under strict quarantine. And thank you for staying with us, Lindsay. I hope you can hear me there.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, now doctors and psychiatrists, and we actually have a doctor who's been with us here. He's still sitting here, the president of the Nigerian Association of Resident Doctors. But doctors and psychiatrists have compared the need, Lindsay, to treat people who are in lockdown and quarantine psychologically to the need to treat victims of terrorism who've seen terrible things. I mean, is it really that bad being locked up at home and experiencing irritability and low mood? Is that equivalent to a sort of post-traumatic stress syndrome?
Well, I'm sure for quite a few people it is, because I can tell you personally, Charles, I'm undergoing a lot of stress because of looking for, daily bread, so to speak. And then the change, this sudden change, it's almost traumatic. A lot of people who have habits of, social habits that they've suddenly had to change, I'm sure they're finding it difficult. And I think that must be taken into consideration when government creates policies for control of this crisis. They must take that into consideration. It is a traumatic experience.
Quite a number of people would agree with that. But let me just ask you to stay with us, Lindsay, and let me bring in Dr. Aliyu Sokombo, who is the president of the Nigerian Association of Resident Doctors. Thank you very much indeed for your patience. I mean, you're not a psychiatrist, obviously, but I mean, most doctors have a sense of the psychiatry of treating people and conditions such as this, even if people are suffering from something less than post-traumatic stress syndrome. I mean, they will most certainly suffer a lot of psychological symptoms. Does that raise the prospect of low adherence to the lockdown measures? In other words, because of low adherence, and that obviously adds to the risk factor, for not being able to contain the virus, which is the point you were making earlier, that people are locked down in order to try and contain the virus. But if they're having psychological symptoms and they don't adhere to those lockdown measures, it rather defeats the purpose, doesn't it?
Well, as much as I want to recognize the psychological effects of the lockdown on people, I think the psychological effect is not as much a problem as much as the economic effects it is on a lot of people in Nigeria. You will agree with me that the majority, as much as 50% of Nigerians, are living below the poverty line. So most of these people are those that have had to contend with the urge to go out there to fend for themselves, to make a living while the COVID-19 lockdown lasts. So I want to believe that the urge, the low compliance with the lockdown is coming more from people who have had to deal with economic consequence of the lockdown rather than the psychological consequence of the lockdown. So what I think is appropriate at this point is for the government to take stringent, appropriate measures to see that the economic need of most of the people that have been asked to stay at home while this COVID-19 is being controlled is taken care of, because as he mentioned that it is practically impossible for people who have to go out every day to fend for themselves to remain and adhere and comply with this lockdown. So I think more of the non-compliance is coming from the economic side rather than the psychological side.
I mean, the psychological thing, as someone said, is more likely to be happening in Western countries than internationally.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, let me bring Lindsay Barrett back in. And I don't mean to be glib, Lindsay, but I wonder whether criminals in Nigeria, the kidnappers, the drug dealers, the armed robbers, etc., I wonder whether they're also suffering from the ill effects of the lockdown and the sort of national and global economic downturn like everyone else is, or do you think they'll find ways of earning their income?
Well, I hate to say it, Charles, but it appears that we are already seeing effects on criminal activity. I hear that in Katsina State and also I think in Benue and Bauchi, there has been an upsurge of home invasions by gangs. Even in Kubwa a week or so ago, they said there was a raid by gangs. We should begin to watch out for these impacts. I'm here, even in Lagos, it has happened. We should be aware that this could happen. This is a society in which the breakdown of law and order is always just around the corner. It's a threat. And under these circumstances, if we're not careful, there may be an escalation. So that is what I fear for the criminal community. I think they may change their tactics and become more bold. And that's something we really have to watch out for.
That's a good point. Dr. Sakumba, let me just bring you in again. I mean, you've seen the Nigerian government, the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19 giving daily briefings, the Minister of Health, the National Centers for Disease Control, all appearing to be on the front line and in the thick of this disease, and the federal government right there with them, apparently. Are you at all impressed by all that, or it doesn't seem to go far enough for you?
Well, I think they are making significant efforts. They are doing their best to get this outbreak contained, but I also believe that much more can be done if more emphasis is paid into getting people to comply with the lockdown, which is very important, and but this can be achieved by ensuring that the palliative that is being given to these people, especially the downtrodden in the society, is taken more seriously than what is being done at the moment. You'll agree with me that even stakeholders from the National Assembly have queried the efficiency of the palliative measures and the way and manner it is being implemented. So if a lot is done to get that addressed, and that will also go a long way in curbing the socio-economic vices.
But from a medical point of view, are you happy with what they're doing?
Well, I am not very impressed, and that is why I stated at some point that a lot of effort needs to be made into testing more and more people, because this is very cardinal in getting this outbreak contained. I have stated earlier that we are testing, we are not testing enough people, and because we are not testing enough people, we are not identifying enough people and isolating them from the other non-infected people. So I think a lot more needs to be done, especially as it relates to testing and testing and testing.
Right, so, okay. Lindsay, we're almost at the end of the program. Do you think we will ever be as comfortable as we once upon a time were with being in a crowd with a sort of casual hug and a kiss? Do you think the world is going to change fundamentally and people are never going to get used to doing that again?
Well, you know, Charles, I always told people that one of the things that made me become a West African was because I love the intimacy with which we greet each other. Things have changed greatly, but it hasn't changed my feelings about my people. So I think once there's a vaccine, once we hear there's a vaccine and we progress to the level of real treatment and cure of this pandemic, then gradually we'll go back to our old ways.
Hey, Lindsay, I want to thank you very much indeed. Lindsay Barrett there, the international journalist and African affairs analyst who is in strict quarantine. And of course, Dr. Aliyu Sakumba, president of the Nigerian Association of Resident Doctors. Thank you ever so much. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye and thank you for watching.